As the war of words heats up between America and Russia over the chemical attack on a rebel-held Syrian town that killed at least 100 civilians, we'll be asking if the ratcheting up of tensions between the two superpowers could suck in other nations to a conflict that until now they have tried to steer well clear of. Meanwhile, Egypt has declared a 3-month state of emergency after the Islamic State group claimed responsibility for the train bombings that struck worshippers as they celebrated Palm Sunday Mass. Were the Egypt attacks the result of the squeeze on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria? And what impact will President al-Sisi's increased powers have on daily life in Egypt? I'm Zhong Shi in for Liu Xing today. Welcome to The Point. U.S. President Donald Trump ordered the military last Thursday to fire 59 Tomahawk missiles at a Syrian airbase. Trump said the missiles were in retaliation for a chemical weapons attack on a rebel-held town that the U.S. and its allies believed to be the work of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and accused Russia for failing to control the Syrian government. Some believe the West might consider starting a new round of sanctions against Russia and even try to remove the Assad government with military force. Yet others say nothing's for sure now, since mixed messages keep coming from the White House. And nobody knows what the U.S.'s long-term goal in the region will ultimately be. So what is the Trump administration's first priority in Syria? Counterterrorism or regime change? Joining me today from New York is Simon Adams, Executive Director at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Simon, thank you for joining us. There was confusion for quite a while, wasn't there, over what the United States wanted to do with Syria. Different conflicting statements from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Ambassador Nikki Haley. But now it seems that Rex Tillerson has changed his stance. Before I get to the first question, let's take a listen to what Tillerson has said.
I think it's clear to all of us that the reign of the Assad family, but the question of how that ends and the transition itself could be very important, in our view, to the durability, the stability inside of a unified Syria, and its stability and durability of the outcome going forward.
U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson over there. Now, Simon, with these latest remarks from Rex Tillerson, let's talk about why the confusion in the first place. And do you think there is now a better formulated policy on Syria, a better streamlined policy on Syria?
I think the Trump administration is trying to cobble together a policy here. I don't think they really had one during the campaign, other than criticizing the Obama administration and criticizing Hillary Clinton specifically. I don't think President Donald Trump cares all that much about Syria up until this point, has really given it much thought at all. Something obviously happened. I mean, there's lots of speculation of why this interest, why this military strike had taken place, and of course he said he was absolutely appalled, as the whole world should be, by that chemical weapons attack that took place last week. So I think what we're seeing now is various people in the Trump administration trying to make sure they get onto the same page, as they say here in the United States of America, on the question of Syria. What that means for America, Russia, the UN, and for the Syrian people themselves is now is still unclear. Whether this was a one-off punitive strike, the rhetoric around the need for Assad to go, or whether the Americans are going to actually do something in Syria.
Simon, let's talk about that crucial personnel change as all of this was unfolding. Steve Bannon let go of his job just as the United States was conducting these missile strikes, reportedly because he wasn't getting along with Jared Kushner, the son of the president. Give us an idea of the decision-making process right now at the White House regarding Syria, the policy formulating circle inside the White House.
Well, that's an almost impossible question to answer, because I don't think anybody knows what the decision-making process inside the White House is on national security issues at the moment. I mean, it seems to be influenced by, in part, whatever is on Fox News and what's rushing through the mind of President Trump at 4 in the morning when he starts tweeting about whatever's concerning him for the day. I mean, the institutions of American power still exist, the National Security Council, the State Department, the U.S. government, and so forth. I think at the moment what we're seeing, or what we think we're seeing in the background, is a sort of a bit of a power struggle between the kind of so-called alt-right, which is just a nice way of, a polite way of describing the kind of white nationalist racists who have captured a part of the Trump constituency, and then other people like McMaster and other kind of senior people inside the U.S. administration who actually have real and genuine national security experience. And there's an ongoing battle about what this means, what the U.S. is going to do, and what the implications are for the Trump presidency.
Simon, and as people wonder what's going to happen next, numbers come in, casualty numbers in the aftermath of those missile strikes. The U.S. missile strike on that air base ended up killing at least 15 civilians. How does the United States justify those strikes, those attacks? Is it more justifiable because they used conventional weapons, because they dropped missiles instead of chemical weapons? This in particular because it's in retaliation of those suspected chemical weapons in Syria in the first place.
Yeah, so let me just be very clear on my own. I'm not on the side of the Assad government, nor am I on the side of the U.S. government. I'm on the side of civilians in Syria who have endured a 6-year civil war in which they have been brutalized, in which they have had crimes against humanity and war crimes subjected against them by all sides, it should be said, in the Syrian conflict. Now, the greatest amount of that illegal war crimes, crimes against humanity, the atrocities that have been perpetrated by the government because they have greater killing capacity as compared to even ISIS or the armed groups. But all sides have violated international humanitarian and human rights law. So I think this airstrike conducted by the U.S. has to be put in the broader context of that overall situation. You know, and it did come supposedly in response to this horrible, heinous attack using chemical weapons against the civilian population, about which there is no doubt that is actually a real and genuine thing that happened. It wasn't the first time. It was a result of many times in which chemical weapons have been used. I'm not in any way justifying the U.S. airstrike, but I think the bigger question is, what is the international community going to do to keep the protection of civilians and the protection of real human rights at the absolute center of their discussions about the Syrian civil war? So I think in some ways, whether this is a one-off airstrike or whether this is part of some broader strategy is in some way not the key issue. The key issue is, how has the international community allowed this civil war to go on for so long?
Simon, thank you so much for talking with us today. Simon Adams from New York there. In response to the U.S. and its allies' accusations, Russia's foreign ministry said in a statement on Monday that the missile strike by the U.S. was an aggressive act against a sovereign state and violated international law. Moreover, Russia also threatened retaliation if there are any further American airstrikes, saying the U.S. attack had crossed red lines. So will Russia resort to a military response in Syria, or is it merely a war of words? For more, I'm now joined by Pavel Falcon, Russian defense analyst from Moscow. Pavel, welcome to the program. Let's begin with what's going to come next. The White House has certainly not ruled out any possibility of further actions against Syria, but give us a scenario. What kind of situational changes on the ground in Syria would prompt a response, further actions from the United States?
It was already announced that if there will be more possible or alleged weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapon attacks in Syria, that there will be more American counter blows. Hopefully that will not happen. The United States right now does not seem to be directly interested, say, in beefing up the opposition, say, the Syrian opposition, say, with anti-aircraft missiles that could seriously hamper the Syrian Air Force and the Russian Air Force in helping the Assad forces and his allies to rout the opposition in different parts of Syria. So that's not on the table, apparently. It should be understood that the American strategy, seemingly, in Syria, as in maybe in other parts of the world, is that Trump comes first. That the interests of Donald Trump are the most important thing. Of course, he believes that America comes first, and he believes most likely that that is the same thing. What's good for America, that's good for Trump, and vice versa. And Trump wants to show the American public and the world that he is not Obama in no case, that where Obama was weak and indecisive, he is strong and decisive. Where Obama could not achieve an agreement, say like with Russia, Trump can achieve an agreement. Where Obama failed in Korea, where Trump will not fail in Korea. So for him, it's all the time important. That ISIL should be destroyed, that he should be seen as a strong and decisive leader. But that does not mean that the White House right now is very much interested in getting very deep into Syria and begin a nation-building attempt there. Changing regime, nation-building, that's not on the cards. And of course, both America and Russia will do the utmost to avoid a direct clash. There's been some hot words, but actually the statement about the red line being crossed, that was apparent from Tehran after talks between the Russian and the Iranian presidents, and Moscow actually disavowed that red line thing. Russian officials have been saying even if there are more American blows in Syria, Russia will not get involved, that Russia is in Syria to fight terrorists and not to fight America.
Pavel, let's talk about Russia. Will Russia take military action after the missile attacks? Do you think there is a heightened danger of military conflicts between Russia and the United States now in Syria?
Well, there is, because of course in retaliation Russia announced that it's stopping the protocol of exchange of so-called deconflicting information. That means Russian and American military were informing each other where they are in Syria and what they're more or less doing to avoid clashes in the air or bombing of Americans by Russians or Russians by Americans. So that information is not exchanged. This has, of course, heightened to some extent the possibility of some kind of accidental clash that could escalate. But again, it's in no one's interest. Actually, in everyone's interest, in Trump's interest, in Putin's interest, is to get a foreign policy success story. So there will be now, this week, with Rex Tillerson in Moscow, there will be a very serious attempt by both sides to have some success, or at least announce a success. Again, that's very important to say that Obama failed and Trump managed. So excluding that during the coming talks, and I'm rather sure that Rex Tillerson will meet with President Putin, that they will announce some kind of, if not a breakthrough, at least serious progress.
Russia has officially notified the United States that it would suspend a communications hotline between Moscow and the Pentagon, but it was precisely because of that hotline that the United States was able to warn Russia of those missile strikes in Syria. Possibility of accidental clashes in the future with that communications line now gone?
Yes, that's possible, of course. That's a possibility. But I believe both sides don't want that, and so they'll find some kind of ways of averting direct clashes. Direct clashes are in no one's interest at all. They could lead to conflict that no one wants and no one needs. And no one will be very victorious, especially Russia, which is, of course, much weaker in the air and on the Mediterranean Sea than America.
Pavel, thank you so much for your time. A weekend of official explanations for President Trump's airstrikes on a Syrian airbase has only added to confusion over whether the administration's focus will be on ousting Mr. Assad or on sticking with Mr. Trump's stated priority of defeating the Islamic State. There is also confusion over the strike's legality, whether they were a one-off attack designed to deter chemical weapons, the start of a larger operation. Mr. Trump has failed to make a compelling legal case or obtain proper international and congressional authorization for attacking a sovereign nation. Mr. Trump did not seek authorization from the Security Council to use force, as the United Nations Charter requires, or have a valid reason for acting in self-defense. As history has shown in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries, trying to solve the Syria issue with such a quick response may make Trump appear more decisive than Obama, but in the long term, it can only make the situation worse. Stay with us. We will be right back after this. Welcome back to The Point. At least 44 are dead and over 100 injured following attacks on two Coptic churches in Egypt on Palm Sunday, one of the holiest days of the Christian calendar. The Islamic State, known as ISIL, has claimed responsibility for the attacks. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi announced a 3-month state of emergency starting Monday. So what's behind the latest increase in violence? To find out more, I'm joined by Bashir Abdel Fattah, political analyst and editor-in-chief of Al Aram in Cairo, and Florence Aid Ogden, CEO and chief economist of Arabia Monitor, joining us from Amman. Welcome to both of you. Let me start with you, Bashir. The Egyptian cabinet approved the 3-month state of emergency on Monday, which gives President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi even wider powers for sure, but what specifically do the extra powers give him, and how would this affect people in Egypt?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me in your program. Indeed, Egypt has faced many terrorist attacks before, and we lived in a state of emergency for many time. More than 4 years we are suffering from the state of emergency. But President al-Sisi declared the state of emergency this time in order to find out a creative security measures against terrorism, especially after the reports that ISIS is coming from Libya now. They crossed the border between Egypt and Libya, and they came to Egypt in order to make such terrorist attacks. So he needs cooperation between the military and the civilian police in order to put an end to this tragic attacks. Many people in Egypt think that the state of emergency makes some sort of threats to democratization in the country, but we still suffer from terrorism, and the government thinks that it needs such measures in order to fight terrorism.
Florence, these twin bombings in Egypt bring back memories of what happened in December. An attack at a Coptic church in Cairo killed 25 people. Islamic extremists have repeatedly targeted Egypt's Christian minority, which makes up around 10% of the population. What do you think is behind this increase in violence?
I think terrorist groups now try to aim Christians in Egypt, because they know very well that it is the sensitive element of the Egyptian society. They know very well that if they made any terrorist attacks against the churches or Christians, this will make a very important reaction in the whole world, because there are many Christians lives in America and in Europe, and at the same time international organizations and international media will control and will talk about this issue. In addition to that, the terrorist groups failed to affect the Egyptian society from Sinai after the attacks the police and the army take against them in Sinai, and also they failed to destroy the Egyptian economy. So they are trying now to search for a new goal, a new aim, which is Christians. Also, during his visit to America, President al-Sisi had many support from the American President Donald Trump, and he also said that al-Sisi succeeded to a great extent to fight terrorism. So they want to say to Trump that al-Sisi is unreliable and he could not fight terrorism or eliminate terrorism from Sinai or from the whole Egyptian society. That's why they aimed the Christian minority in Egypt.
Let me turn now to Florence in Amman. Florence, your take on the reasons behind the surge of violence targeting Copts?
Well, I think it's clear that what's happening regionally is that ISIS is getting squeezed out of the initial strongholds it established for itself. So the battle for Mosul is now almost over. The battle for Raqqa in Syria is about to begin. Their attempt to establish themselves in Sirte in Libya has not been terribly successful. And therefore, as they are being squeezed out from those various other locations, they need a new center of activity. And it's clear that Egypt looks like a fairly attractive one to them. What is also clear is that they have figured out that Egypt's delicate sectarian balance is a good tool for them to deploy in destabilizing Egypt and thereby gaining influence in Egypt via instability. And so we all know that sectarian tensions have been latent in Egypt. We all know that the minority Christian population of Egypt has never felt completely comfortable and does feel somewhat discriminated against and defensive, and therefore they are playing that card because it's an easy card to play at this stage. Unfortunately, the problem really divides itself into two sub-problems. The emergency rule that President Sisi has now instituted is obviously one measure, one way of dealing with things. It's not clear that these sorts of solutions solve problems like the one we have emerging in Egypt. However, it's also not clear that peace can be achieved without them, at least from the perspective of security forces. What is important is to work both on the long term and the short term in all of these Arab countries with minority religious populations, be they Christians or Shia or otherwise. And by this, what I mean is genuinely developing a culture of tolerance and a culture of protection of minorities and the culture of representation of minorities. The country where I am today is an excellent example, Jordan, of leadership that really looks out for minorities, ensures that minorities are represented across government, across the public sector, and therefore protects tolerance, defends and protects tolerance, rather than just saying that tolerance is an important thing and not really doing the necessary in order to promote tolerance. And it's tolerance that prevents people from turning an event like the one we saw last week in Egypt, unfortunately, into an incident.
Florence, on that note, I wanted to ask you, because this year has witnessed terrorist attacks in Turkey, the UK, Pakistan, Russia, Egypt, and Sweden. To name just a few, why are the terrorist attacks extending so rapidly across the globe? What can we read into the expansion of violence? You were talking about tolerance, but is tolerance the key here? Could tolerance solve the problems?
The reason why attacks are extending beyond the initial geographies when they first began by ISIS in 2014 is because they are trying to demonstrate they have international reach, and because they are being squeezed out of their initial areas of influence, as I mentioned a moment ago. What else can they do? They're trying to survive, and they're trying to demonstrate that they can survive by showing just how far-reaching their tentacles can be. Tolerance is the only way forward in the long term, absolutely. But in the short term, obviously, better security measures. And I would have very much liked to see much more strict security measures on Palm Sunday at the churches that suffered in Egypt.
Florence and Bashir, we are running out of time here. One last question, if you can. What do the latest bombings in Egypt, what kind of impact do they have on the society in Egypt? And do they weaken the powers of President al-Sisi? Let me start with you, Bashir.
Syrians are angry now because they think that to a great extent the security measures and security devices didn't succeed to protect them. But I think most of the Egyptians know that Egypt is targeted from terrorism, and Christians as in particular are targeted. So I think there is a good terms between Christians and the presidency, and they know well that both Muslims and Christians are both targeted from terrorism. In the future, I think there will be cooperation between the police and the military.
Bashir, I'm sorry to interrupt. We are indeed running out of time here, Bashir and Florence. Thank you so much for your time. Sunday's attacks come just weeks before a planned visit to Egypt by Pope Francis, the latest step in a long-running effort to forge stronger ties between the Catholic Church and Muslim leaders. The visit by Francis, if it goes ahead, is likely to be a security nightmare. The 9 million Copts are the biggest Christian minority community in the Middle East, accounting for around 10% of Egypt's population. The fear among many of them is that the 2 suicide bombings, which killed 44 people and injured more than 100 at churches on Palm Sunday, are just a taste of what is to come in Islamic State's ongoing campaign. The latest attacks and the driving out of Copts from Sinai in February under threat of assassination has inevitably undermined any confidence in al-Sisi, who has sought to portray himself as a bulwark against sectarianism and terrorism. And that is it for this edition of The Point on CGTN. I'm Zhongshi. Thank you for watching.